Let's talk through every single core stratagem in Warhammer 40k 10th edition, how they work including a few rule subtleties, and when I think about using them or avoiding them in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be interesting to take a focused look at the core stratagems in the game which everyone has the opportunity to spend their command points on. Most armies will generally have quite a lot of options open to them in this way, and I certainly feel like some of them get overused and underused and occasionally played wrong. In 10th edition, mercifully compared with 9th edition, we've got access to far fewer stratagems. Games Workshop shifted things around so there's a bit more bulk in the core part of the game, with everyone basically knowing quite well the 11 stratagems they have access to there, and only having 6 unique ones depending on your detachment, as opposed to the rather monstrous amount of often slightly redundant choices that we had back in 9th edition. I feel like cutting down on the stratagem bloat was certainly one positive thing that came out of 10th. As well as that, in many match games we arguably have 12, with the 12th being the New Order stratagem as well. That's very relevant if you're playing a Leviathan mission deck game, and certainly another place in which you can spend command points. And out of all of these options, a lot of them are much stronger than others. I generally feel like they haven't managed to write any complete dud ones, and they're all at least situationally useful, though some are far more niche than others, or might only be relevant for a few units with certain keywords. In this video I thought we'd go through each of them in turn, talk about the way that they work, a few rules, quirks and interactions with some common rules out there in game, and when I think about usually using them or avoiding them, as it can be a mistake to forget a key option, but it definitely can also be a mistake to waste command points when it doesn't really make sense. For this video I'm going to be focusing on the updated version of the core stratagems, as weirdly enough they were changed in 2 different places since 10th edition launched. The Balanced Data Slate nerfed the Insane Bravery stratagem and Overwatch, and the designer's commentary tightened the language on a couple of stratagems including the command point reroll and rapid ingress, though it's not super obvious if you go back to check them from Games Workshop core rules document, as it seems that they decided against updating that digital rule set. I think perhaps for consistency purposes, I feel like it might have been helpful to at least signal on that document that there were changes elsewhere. All that aside though, let's jump into them and talk through the 12 core stratagems in turn. First up, for 2 CP we've got Heroic Intervention. This is 2 command points to basically try and countercharge an enemy unit. You trigger it when an enemy unit successfully makes a charge move and moves into engagement range with one of your units, and then a different unit that's within 6 inches can trigger Heroic Intervention, declare a charge on the enemy that just charged you. If they roll high enough to bring you into engagement range, then you can move that charge, though you don't get the charge bonus for fighting first, and you can't use it on non-walker vehicles. For what it means with a charge bonus, that does just mean the fights first bit that you get from charging. So usually if you heroic intervene into an enemy unit, that enemy unit is normally going to be able to attack you before you get to attack them. But you still do get other benefits that you might get on the charge, such as the +1 strength and attack bonuses for things like World Eaters or the Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius. In general, I feel like Heroic Intervention is one of the slightly rarer ones to come up in gameplay, mainly just because 2 command points is a big investment and it needs to be the exact right circumstances to be able to use it. But occasionally when it does come up it can be absolutely massive, if it say suddenly allows you to destroy an enemy unit in their own turn, and then your big scary threat can go off to do something else in yours. You could use the stratagem to basically position your units so if the enemy charges one of your weaker outlying units, you can potentially heroic intervene into them with something that the enemy really can't handle or afford to be in close combat with. Depending on what's doing the charging though, occasionally the opponent might just be able to charge in such a way that you don't get within 6 inches, and you don't have the option to use the stratagem. In general, you want to do it with really big, scary, powerful units that aren't going to worry about the enemy's attacks from destroying them, but have enough damage to be able to kill the enemy units. Fights first can also be helpful potentially, as that means that if your unit already has that, you could potentially basically get the jump on the enemy unit that was charging. They thought that they would be able to strike first and destroy your unit, but instead the heroic intervening unit strikes first and kills them. One downside is that you're not guaranteed to make that 6-inch charge. It's quite a big risk when you're spending 2 CP on it already, and you're likely not going to have the command points to re-roll it. You're always odds on to make it, but having it not guaranteed is a bit painful. Overall, between all that, I feel like situations where it actually comes up are slightly rare, and by that point you might have already spent those command points, so you don't have enough spare for shenanigans like this. But potentially if the enemy charges with a medium tier threat, trying to destroy one of your more fragile but important units, you could potentially have them wiped out in turn by your own big scary unit heroic intervening. 2 CP for a major enemy unit destroyed or badly mauled could well be worth it. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got some Morale Command with Insane Bravery. This one's a 1 command point that you can only use once per game, and you use it to basically cancel a battle shock test before you take it. You don't get to roll and see if you passed or failed before applying this. It was fairly heavily toned down since the start of 10th edition. It's quite a lot less useful if you don't get to roll and see the result first, as you might well be spending a command point on a battle shock test that you would have passed anyway. For rule subtleties of this one, it does only apply to battle shock tests that are actually done in the battle shock step of the command phase, so basically the normal 10th edition leadership mechanics, as opposed to most other tests which happen at other points. For example, it can't be used against the Tyrannid Shadow in the Warp, as that triggers during the command phase and not necessarily the battle shock test, or other rules are resolved in the command step, and you can't be using this for leadership tests and things done elsewhere in the turn. You basically have to weigh up whether or not it's worth the chance of your unit failing the battle shock. For a leadership 6 plus unit, it's usually a 28% chance to fail, or a leadership 7 plus, it's a 42% chance, and you need to decide whether or not eliminating that risk is going to be overall worth it to the game versus other things that you could spend the command points on. A lot of the time, if it's a leadership 7 unit and it's the only thing that's holding an objective that you want to score and score an extra 5 victory points on or something, I'd say that often Insane Bravery can be the right choice for that, but perhaps if it's looking like the game is very heavily going to go one way or the other, and the main thing is piling everything into the damage game, spending command points on this sort of thing might not be the best option versus, say, saving it for really big overwatches or command point rerolls of charges, which could be pivotal. It's definitely one to value more highly in the later game though, when damage is perhaps a little bit less important versus scoring every point possible. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got the Trusty Grenade Stratagem. 1 command point for a unit that has the grenades keyword and hasn't shot yet to attack the enemy. You get to pick 1 enemy unit within 8 inches, provided your unit's not in engagement range and can see that unit, and you roll 6 dice. For each 4+, they take a mortal wound. It's perhaps not super obvious from the way that the stratagem's worded, but you basically can use this if you're either advancing or falling back. I'm not necessarily 100% sure that it was intended, but the only requirement is that your unit hasn't been selected to shoot this phase yet. There's no actual requirement to be able to shoot to actually throw grenades around. It can make it kind of powerful, as it's a way for a unit that's falling back to throw damage against the enemy that was attacking it, and that can be kind of big, or potentially throwing some damage out if the only way to see the enemy unit was to advance, or needed to advance anyway to get to an objective or something. Just for raw damage output, 3 mortal wounds I'd say is alright, but not super standout. It's obviously going to have most value against big, really tough things with higher saves, like say maybe Space Marine Land Raiders, or if it's actually going to produce a big swing in the game. So say you're throwing a grenade and destroying an enemy unit that is absolutely going to survive till next turn otherwise, and then deal some major damage to you. That way you're both destroying enemy units and directly saving some of your own at the same time. I say for most armies, you can often do better than 3 mortal wounds for 1 command point. It really depends on the sort of stratagems that you have access to. For some armies though, it can be really quite big, perhaps particularly things like horde armies that don't have tons of high strength damage dealing. Can just be nice to throw out a little bit of focal mortal wound output that can take down something important. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Hero Skirmishing with Epic Challenge. This one's a fairly simple one in 1 command point for one of your character models to gain the Precision keyword in the fight phase. Precision basically means that you can allocate your attacks towards enemy character models before the rest of their bodyguards. So it sort of means that you can snipe enemy characters out of their retinues, though the rules for Precision do mean that you need to actually have line of sight on the character that you're targeting. So if you're in a big sprawling combat where you can't actually see the enemy hero, you wouldn't actually be able to gain any value from it. In general, I would rate this one as at least kind of niche as well, though against the right enemy army and big power combo units it can be kind of big. It does just feel there's usually quite a lot of things that need to happen one after another for it actually to be worth it. You need to be fighting an enemy unit, and you need to have a character in your unit, and then you need not to be wiping out the enemy squad anyway with loads of damage output, as otherwise there's no real point in spending CP for precision. And you need that enemy character model both to be feasibly killable by your character model in a single round of combat, and also it not be more value to just destroy more bodyguard models, which could also be threatening things that have got a lot of scary attacks, and they might be easier to kill. Then it actually needs to be worth the extra 1 command point cost to slay that character potentially early, given the risk of failing to do so. And also directly just then and there, it needs to make more sense to use this epic challenge as opposed to any other damage or defensive type stratagem for that unit in combat. Even with saying all that though, there are plenty of times when it absolutely is worth it. It's perhaps most reliably useful when you've got a massive, great big scary melee threat that's a character, maybe even something like an Imperial Knight or a Demon Primarch or something wandering around and charging into an enemy power combo. Otherwise it can just be very useful if the opponent's got a good supporting character that might not be all that tough in their own right, but is otherwise applying a fairly nasty buff to the unit that they're guiding. Maybe things like an Orc Pain Boy, given the 5+ Feel No Pain can be a big deal to take out early, given that he's got low saves and only 3 wounds. Or perhaps just something extra fighty where the main damage threat is coming from that specific model. Perhaps a Chaos Lord that it would be pivotal to kill early before he fights and activates his Rage mode with a whole bunch of damage 3 attacks. I feel like this one is maybe a slightly more niche one, and it's sometimes forgotten a bit too much, though some people kind of fixate on it and use it when it might not be really all that worth it. But it's absolutely worth bearing in mind when you are smashing 2 units together that are likely to damage each other but not fully destroy each other, and this could be big. Next up, let's take a look at that one from the Leviathan mission deck in New Orders. This one impacts the secondary missions, and you basically use it at the end of your command phase, where you take one active secondary mission card, discard it, and then draw a new one. You can only use it once per battle. This one's basically directly an effort to try and trade a command point for some victory points, and in general I feel like it's at least fairly high yield if you draw something that's literally impossible or is so impractical to do that it's not worth it. And there's plenty of others still in the deck that you know that you could credibly do with the rest of your army. It tends to be more useful if you've got lots of units all over the board and can threaten to take multiple different objectives if you really need to. If the game is kind of close, then this could certainly swing you a few victory points. Again, it's one to particularly consider slightly later game versus earlier. You'd obviously have to be weighing this up against anything else you absolutely needed that command point for this turn. But if it's not going to be massive, then I feel like it's often absolutely quite worth it. The only other thing that I'd say is that if you don't have an army that generates command points somehow with a character like Marnius Calgar or Lord Solar Leontus or similar, you might be kind of effectively binning off 2 command points for this rather than 1. As well as spending 1 CP to redraw, you wouldn't be ditching that bad secondary objective at the end of your turn either. And if you hold on and accept that you just can't do that objective this turn, then that generates you a command point, which can be pretty valuable with all the things that you can do with it, and might help contribute towards winning the game overall in other directions. Next up for 2 command points we've got Counter-Offensive. This is the Interrupt style stratagem for close combat. It's a big 2 CP one, but can be really potent in the right situation. You basically pay 2 command points to fight next, and can only trigger it after an enemy unit has just fought. Most commonly it's used when the enemy has declared multiple charges in their own turn. In normal circumstances, they'd be fighting first with everything that charged, one after the other, and the order might not matter. But if you've got 2 command points to threaten this, then they basically get to pick their favourite combat to fight first, and then you can look at the rest of the combats out there and decide if there's anywhere where it would make sense for you to seize the initiative, spend 2 command points, and then get to swing with your unit first. In the ideal situation, cutting down an enemy unit that was just about to destroy your unit before they've even had chance to swing. Getting a full fight phase with a unit that might not have been able to attack at all otherwise can be absolutely massive in Warhammer 40K. Potentially you could be effectively trading 2 command points for an enormous amount of damage, and beyond that you might also be getting extra save value in terms of your units not dying. It can be pretty powerful to threaten this, and can certainly give you some unlikely victories. If you ever manage to destroy an absolutely massive and vital enemy unit before they kill one of yours, then it could be absolutely game changing. I feel like in 10th edition there aren't maybe quite as many opportunities for using this as in 9th, just given the 2 command point costs and the chance that you might have spent it on things like Overwatch earlier in the turn. And there are still plenty of places where using this is kind of borderline. Maybe the damage output that you get isn't really quite as massive, or it might not necessarily turn the tables unless you roll well, and it can be a bit tricky to weigh up whether it's worth it or not, or spending those command points for other good stuff. Next up, for 1 command point, and usually for vehicles, we've got Smokescreen. This one's a war gear stratagem where you need to have the keyword. A few non-vehicle things do have it, like certain infiltrating types troops with smoke bombs. This one's a nice reactive defensive stratagem. You use it when your vehicle or anything else with the keyword is shot in the shooting phase, and then the unit that triggered it is then -1 to hit and also gets the benefit of cover. Between the 2 debuffs when the stars align, this can be a pretty monumental increase in durability. For example, if you had a 3+ save vehicle sat out in the open and were being shot by an AP -2 weapon, you'd basically be increasing the overall unit's durability by +77%, not too far off needing double the firepower to take it down between the improved save and the worse ballistic skill. In 10th edition though, a lot of things get cover anyway, and it can be far more borderline if your unit already has cover. Maybe a bit more useful against armies with low ballistic skill if they're hitting you on 4s or worse, and they aren't getting most of their damage output from critical hits on 6s. It's definitely one that comes up though. Certainly for big scary battle tanks with high saves, it can be well worth it. Things like Guard, Rogue Dawns or Leman Rosses get a lot of value, or potentially things like Rhino transports trying to stay safe and keep their cargo alive and undamaged until they get to strike. Moving on, we come to the rather awesome Rapid Ingress, one command point for your unit to arrive at the reserves round at the end of the enemy movement phase rather than yours. This one's a pretty strong one to set up a near guaranteed devastating strike from a strong unit in your turn. The usual idea is that you have a big scary threat, either in deep strike or strategic reserve. Use one command point for Rapid Ingress to bring it in after you've got perfect knowledge of your entire opponent's movement phase, and then you put that unit down somewhere where it's fairly safe, either behind a big ruin so the enemy can't shoot it with most things, or at the edge of the board with strategic reserves, but in a place where the opponent really isn't in a good spot to do anything further about it that turn. And then when it gets to your turn, that unit can happily move up, do a whole load of damage, and likely make a very easy charge into close combat for plenty of scary deep strike melee infantry, and can be one of the best ways to get them there and have them fighting the enemy in close. Probably some of the more common questions with Rapid Ingress is whether you can do it in combination with certain rules like arriving early in the game, but it often just doesn't work particularly well in conjunction with ways that rules are often written in 10th edition. The rules are often set up, say, this unit can arrive in turn 1 in the reinforcement step of your movement phase, which means that Rapid Ingress wouldn't work with that particular unit. In terms of game-changing value out of stratagems, I feel like Rapid Ingress absolutely can be a massive swing. Perhaps the best idea usually would be to get a big charge and destroy something very critical in the heart of the opponent's army, a big scary destructive unit that's either got firepower or melee, and getting the jump out of it where they don't really get any chance to interact with you bar Overwatch, and then take out something important with your big threat rather than your big threat get hit first. It definitely does have its weaknesses though. It is kind of dependent on the opponent not having immense board control and just being able to screen out the majority of the board. If that's the case, then you still might have kind of limited options for where you can do this, and it is a bit random depending on whether you're going first or second. I think Rapid Ingress often tends to be a lot more useful if you're going second rather than going first, as it means that you can trigger it in the opponent's battle round 2, so your unit might get into melee on your battle round 2, as opposed to have to wait until your battle round 3. In general though, it's really powerful if used right. I still have seen some people overusing it when it just doesn't really make sense though. Sometimes it might just genuinely be better to try deep strike charge and re-roll the 9-inch charge distance if you fail. The risk that you don't get in might be a downside, but might not outweigh the fact that your unit's contributing to the game too late otherwise. And certainly it could be an active negative if you think you're being very clever using Rapid Ingress, and then you just put the unit somewhere where the enemy can dedicate a bit of fire to it, and just destroys it for fairly easy effort. Still though, I think that this one's absolutely strong and definitely can be built around. Often means that there's a good reason to have at least one scary threat in reserve, whether it's strategic reserves or it's deep strikers. Can just be a really nice way to make sure one of your units destroys an enemy unit rather than the other way around. Next up, at least in my experience, this might be one of the most rarely used general purpose stratagems. Go to ground costs 1 command point, and it basically gets your infantry squad cover and a 6+ invulnerable save when your opponent's shooting them in their shooting phase. It basically feels like the infantry equivalent of the smoke stratagem, though in general it's going to be a lot less useful, as you're not also getting that stealth -1 to hit benefit. Even for a unit that's got literally no saving throws, I feel like that 6+ invulnerable save is rarely going to be worth it. Just going from no save to a 6+ invulnerable is only taking down around about 20% of the enemy damage output, and that's usually not going to be meaningful between your unit living or dying. I think if you were to use this, it'd generally be better to use it to get cover on something that's already got quite a high save, maybe a 3+ save or better unit being shot by something with a bit of AP. Occasionally that could absolutely be well worth it. There are plenty of durable infantry units, like Terminator equivalents or Space Marine equivalents about there, and getting effectively +1 to your saving throws against shooting is genuinely fairly helpful. But I feel like in practice this one is kind of rarely used, both because the benefit of cover is kind of easy to get in 10th edition tables in general, and also because quite a lot of armies have access to some sort of Armour of Contempt equivalent, which if they do is usually going to be just as good as this, and it makes go to ground not feel particularly interesting or superior. I guess it is a battle tactic, so it could theoretically be used for free with a captain equivalent out there. Definitely one to bear in mind in your box of tricks along with command point rerolls if you do have something with free stratagems leading infantry. Though I must admit I haven't seen this used quite as regularly as some of the rest out there in 40k. Moving on to one of the most ubiquitous ones though, we've got the command point reroll. Spend one command point and reroll a single dice roll, limited to a select list of them spelled out on the stratagem. You can use it for an advanced roll, charge roll, desperate escape, a hazardous test, a hit roll, wound roll, damage roll, or saving throw, or a roll to determine the number of attacks made by a weapon, say with a big blast weapon with 2d6 shots. Perhaps most notably, this one doesn't allow you to re-roll battle shock tests, unlike in 9th edition and 8th edition where you could re-roll leadership tests. And while most of these will usually affect just a single dice, there are a few things that could allow you to re-roll 2 dice at once. So say if you re-roll the charge roll, it has to be 2 dice re-rolled there. Or if you're firing a multi-d6 blast weapon that's really quite big and lots of shots, you'd re-roll all the dice, not just one. In the designer's commentary, they also modified the wording a little bit to make it super clear that it targets the unit that you're using the free stratagem for, even if it's one of their attacks. And I guess that was to make it super clear for the free stratagem type abilities for things like Space Marine Captains or Necron Overlords adding rerolls. Command rerolls are a bit tempting to use at the drop of a hat. You could literally use them in basically any interaction to just up the damage or defense of the unit. And probably for newer players, it's perhaps more important to emphasize not to overuse it rather than to underuse it. When you're firing, you can't really afford to be command rerolling it every time you miss the shot of a big exciting gun like a las cannon. If you just want to plug them into more damage if every bit is critical, then it's probably best on wound rolls that you were going to wound on a 2 anyway, and if you do wound it's going to be a big d6 or more damage. And for random damage characteristics where the enemies already failed their save, and then if you roll a 1 on that, then rerolling that can average an extra 2.5 wounds. In general for damage though, I'd usually be a lot more tempted to use it if it's the last chance to destroy something in your shooting phase. So say if you just need to up the chance of destroying an important enemy monster or vehicle, and this is one of the last chances to do so. Or occasionally for firepower efficiency, where if throwing a reroll at one shooting attack is enough to have a good chance to destroy one target outright, then maybe the next big scary gun thing on your army can fully focus all of its firepower on the next thing, which can help a bit of efficiency. The same is kind of true for saves as well. Probably most important, if the opponent doesn't have loads more attacks to throw at your unit, then it might well be worth re-rolling a 4+ invulnerable save to have a chance of keeping a character alive or something. But it's going to be kind of meaningless if it's early in the shooting phase and the enemy might have tons of attacks to go. You might just be throwing away a re-roll if you maybe ward off that one bit of damage, but then they've got loads of other things to destroy your important unit with anyway. I say probably the single most impactful use of a command point re-roll is often a charge roll. It certainly happens that you often have big scary melee units that need, say, a 6 or 7 to get into close combat. They will be odds on to make it, but the chance is far from certain. Sometimes it can have worked out to be a really bad idea if you spent your last command point on other damage stratagems early in the turn and you don't have one spare for a bit of insurance on the charge. The difference between failing a charge and making a charge in 40k can be an entire slain enemy unit, and it's not often that you get the opportunity to trade one command point for that. Again, as a battle tactic, this one's kind of relevant for captains. If they've not found anything better to use their free stratagem on this turn, then just re-rolling a wound roll or a saving throw can be a bit of value, or certainly keeping it for a charge roll if they need it. Given how useful it can be, and sometimes it's massively valuable like the charge rolls as well, it can be a good one to use any abilities that you have to increase the cost of a stratagem for the rest of the game. Maybe a nice enough target for the Calatus Assassin to increase the cost to 2 CP. Overall, definitely an important stratagem. Probably best not to overuse it though, given that often a lot more codex stratagems tend to have a bit more overall value. Next up, we've got a bit of vehicle demolition derby and tank shock. One command point for a whole bunch of mortal wound impact hits when a vehicle completes a charge move. The number of mortal wounds that you get can be quite random and swingy. The formula is to roll a dice per each pip of strength that the vehicle has. So say if it had a strength 10 weapon, that would be 10 dice, and add another 2 dice to the equation if that strength is higher than the target's toughness. Then for each of those dice that comes up a 5+, you get a mortal wound, capped at a maximum of 6, so even if you roll ridiculously high, you can't go completely overboard with it. Relying on 5+s does mean it's really quite swingy though. It's pretty easy both to roll perhaps surprisingly more than you might expect, and also get very little damage output if you're unlucky. In general, for quite a few vehicles that have some alright strength characteristics, it can just be an extra nasty source of damage output. For a strength 12 Dreadnought or Walker, then you might be getting somewhere along the lines of 4 to 5 mortal wounds out of that, on average turn on turn, and that could easily be worth one command point against certain targets, particularly if it helps you swing a combat from a defeat to a victory. It can both be good against high save units and helping horde clearance if you've only got a few powerful attacks. It can also make some vehicles into surprisingly threatening, even if they're quite cheap and don't have that good weapons. Maybe Orc Truck Wrecking Balls being one of the best examples there. They won't be doing all that much damage either at shooting or in close combat, but if you add Tank Shock into the mix, they can skirmish perhaps surprisingly hard for objectives with outlying enemy units. It can also be a big deal if the only way to actually deal damage to a unit is to charge it. Say you can't get the angle on them to shoot it, or you desperately need to charge anyway to get your unit onto an objective. Tank Shock can be excellent to throw into the equation there. And occasionally for big scary combat walkers, potentially you could use Tank Shock to destroy one enemy unit that you just charged, and then when you get to activate to fight, you get to move your 3 inches and potentially pile into something else and attack it from there. Overall, I think it's quite a fun stratagem, both ways to use it, just literally for adding pure damage and also for some tactics and shenanigans. Certainly handy enough to keep in mind for just about any army list that has some vehicles, and particularly for certain ones that have got a lot of high strength things, where it can be a major source of damage output. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Overwatch, perhaps one of the most interesting and nuanced out of the stratagems. I did make an entire video about this, feel free to give it a search after if you like. You basically get to trigger this as sort of reactive shooting to whenever an enemy unit either starts or ends a move, starts or ends a charge, or arrives from reserves, transports, or does a teleport type move. The stratagem states set up on the board, which all of those things encompass. The unit only hits on 6s regardless of modifiers, and after the updated version that they did in the balanced data slate, there are really quite a lot of restrictions on it. You need line of sight, so no using it for artillery type units. You can't target lone operatives greater than 12 inches away, as you're shooting as if it were the shooting phase. You can't use it on Titanic units at all now, which certainly makes the Knight Valiant sad. The target must be within 24 inches in general, so you can outrange it, and you can only use it once per turn per army. There are a few bits of rules weirdness with Overwatch, which I think might be handy enough to have an FAQ at some point, if just to clarify intention with it. The after they charge Overwatch is very rarely possible due to the way that pistols and big guns never tire, and the out of phase rules thing works with the designer's commentary. I believe despite it being a thing that you can trigger for the Overwatch stratagem for, you can't actually target those units due to the out of phase rules not allowing those supporting shooting rules to work in the enemy's charge phase. Though I believe that you can target an enemy unit that has just charged into, say, one of your own monsters and vehicles with something completely different. I think that's one of the few cases in which you can overwatch something that's done a charge like that, though feel free to correct me down in the comments if I have made some sort of error there. The once per turn restriction is also kind of weird and sort of contradicts several rules out there that say you can fire Overwatch again with this unit, even if you used it another time in this phase. Those rules are worded like it's implied that you can use Overwatch multiple times, but technically it still doesn't override the once per turn restriction that the core stratagem has, so currently at least rules as written it's just one Overwatch per turn in general. Overall though, again it's one of the most powerful and commonly used stratagems, often can just be a way to get a bit more direct damage on an enemy unit. That can be good just in its own merit if you've got an enormous shooting unit that's got some very scary firepower. There's all sorts of things that can make it better as well, like say having access to full reroll hits, like Necrons in the Canoptech Court perhaps, or if you've got things that give you sustained hits or lethal hits, it means that your Overwatch is extra devastating, as the only hits that you were getting anyway will be 6s. The kings of Overwatch are definitely the torrent weapons though. Things like Land Raider Redeemer Flamestorm cannons are particularly awesome. If you can have a powerful torrent unit move up to get full line of sight to an objective marker, it means that potentially you could deny the enemy the ability to move onto that marker without getting hit by a whole bunch of weapons. Otherwise though, just for damage dealing, probably the most important thing can be if you can destroy an enemy unit that was just about to deal you major damage. Say for example, if an enemy moves up a damaged tank that only had say 3 wounds left, and you've got a big scary anti-tank unit that could have a small chance to overwatch it to death, that could well be very worth it. Not only do you get the extra damage, but you also get to prevent whatever that unit was just about to destroy. For movement type things, it's also worth remembering that you can also trigger it at the start of a move as well. That one maybe is the one that catches people out a little bit, as it can be one of the less intuitive places to use it. Overall, it's really quite a commonly used and powerful stratagem for good reason. A lot of times it can just add a bit of vital chip damage that can actually be really impactful during the opponent's turn. And for some scary torrent units, it can be a way to destroy entire units of enemies in their turn as well, and a big reason to take them in the first place. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of a roundup of some of the core stratagems in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Look forward to hearing your thoughts as to their use down in the comments below. For you personally, which ones of these are the ones that you tend to use the most or you like the best, and which ones tend to rarely come up? Look forward to hearing your thoughts. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I'll also leave a link to the full How to Play 40k playlist that I've got down in the video description as well if you'd like to see some other explainer guides. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, one way in which you can help support is the channel's Patreon page, as that's the main thing that allows me to keep all these videos coming quite so regularly with new uploads each day. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.